Israeli airstrikes kill at least 6 people from the same family in Gaza as Israel steps up attacks ahead of a looming ground offensive. Demonstrators in Europe and beyond take to the streets as the bloody Israel-Hamas conflict rages on. At least 6 people from the same family have been killed in the besieged Gaza Strip from an Israeli airstrike which struck a house on Sunday afternoon. Dozens of injured people were rushed to hospital, many of them children, covered in dust and blood following the blast. The strike comes as Israel steps up attacks from the air ahead of an expected offensive on the ground. Fears over the risk of the war mushrooming into a wider Middle East conflict also rose on Sunday as deadly clashes along its border with Lebanon intensified. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu has warned the Hezbollah militant group against opening a second war front.
אם חיזבאללה יחליט להיכנס למלחמה, הוא יתגעגע למלחמת לבנון השנייה. הוא יעשה את טעות חייו. ואנחנו נכה בו בעוצמה שהוא לא יכול אפילו לדמיין. והמשמעות לו ולמדינת לבנון היא הרסנית.
The last war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006 left 1,200 people dead on the Lebanese side and 160 dead on the Israeli side.
A candlelight vigil and protest in Tel Aviv for the 1,400 Israelis killed since the Hamas militant group launched attacks on southern Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's military continue to bombard the Gaza Strip and say it will step up its assault on the territory in preparation for a looming counter-offensive.
אנחנו צריכים להיכנס בתנאים הטובים ביותר, תוך כדי גם הסתכלות על כלל הדברים שקורים בהערכת המצב שלנו, וכרגע מה שאנחנו עושים זה נכנסים בתנאים הטובים ביותר לשלב הבא למלחמה.
The Palestinian Health Ministry says at least 4,650 people have died in Gaza. Syrian state media says at least 1 civilian has died after Israel struck airports in war-torn Damascus and Aleppo. Meanwhile, Israel continues to trade fire with the Hezbollah militant group on the border with Lebanon.
Demonstrators in Europe and beyond took to the streets on Sunday, some to oppose anti-Semitism and others to show their support for Palestinians. Hundreds of people gathered in Sarajevo, bombed and besieged during the Bosnian War in the 1990s, to show solidarity with the plight of Palestinians in Gaza. Thousands of people were rallying in Berlin and London on Sunday to oppose anti-Semitism and support Israel. Earlier, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz inaugurated a new synagogue in the eastern city of Dessau, saying that Germany stands firmly on Israel's side. He also said that he was outraged by the upsurge in anti-Semitism since the conflict began. Several buildings in Berlin where Jews live had the Star of David painted on doors and walls, and assailants threw 2 Molotov cocktails at a synagogue in Berlin last week.
Free them immediately. Pray for you and all the families that we stand.
Being held captive by the Hamas militant group inside the Gaza Strip.
Traffic at Slovenia's border with Croatia after Ljubljana introduced border checks with its Balkan neighbor and Hungary. The move, announced on Thursday, is set to last at least 10 days and was effective from Saturday. Slovenia's government says the checks are necessary to prevent terrorism and organized crime and comes amid recent Islamist attacks in Western Europe and the Israel-Hamas war.
Mejna kontrola na teh mejnih prehodih se izvaja ciljno, kar pomeni, da je usmerjena v odkrivanje oseb, ki bi lahko povzročale oziroma ki predstavljale tveganje za javni red in bi lahko izvrševale teroristične grožnje Republiki Slovenije.
Under the European Union's Schengen rules, member states like Slovenia or Italy can temporarily reintroduce border controls if internal security or public policy are at risk. Denmark and Sweden are also expected to introduce similar restrictions.
It was the final chance for voters in Switzerland to cast their ballots on Sunday as the country chose its next legislature. Right-wing populist the SVP looks set to sweep the polls following a campaign fueled by anti-mass migration and anti-woke rhetoric. The Alpine nation is voting for all 200 seats in the National Council lower house of Parliament and all 46 in the Council of State's upper chamber. The vote could indicate another European country turning towards right-wing populist politics as it weighs up how to tackle global warming at a time of rising inflation. 1 year ago, Italy's new far-right and Eurosceptic government raised concerns among European democracies. So what assessment can be made of the first year of the Italian Prime Minister? Has Giorgia Meloni succeeded in dispelling her neo-fascist label?
Sicuramente c'è stato un tentativo di smarcarsi dall'etichetta neofascista. Il tentativo mi sembra solo parzialmente riuscito.
Over the past year, Gianfranco Pellegrino says Meloni's domestic policy appears to have aligned with her far-right ideology.
Le tre misure più importanti sui diritti civili sono state il rendere la GPA un reato universale, avere favorito in qualche maniera che i prefetti non riconoscessero in maniera automatica i figli nati da GPA che venivano dall'estero e le recenti misure sulla natalità. Meloni ha detto molto chiaramente che le donne che hanno più di 2 figli danno un contributo alla società. C'è l'idea che la famiglia naturale, che deriva dalla coppia eterosessuale, è la cellula fondamentale della società. Famiglie che sono fatte da coppie di persone di sesso dello stesso sesso, oppure famiglie che sono fatte da un solo genitore, oppure persone che decidono di non avere figli. Queste persone dovrebbero venire discriminate, hanno di fronte allo Stato un valore inferiore.
In foreign policy, Meloni has juggled between distancing herself from the anti-EU sentiment that marked her political career and maintaining alliances with far-right countries.
Il suo obiettivo fondamentale è stato proprio quello di consolidare un'immagine affidabile, diversa da quella che era stata dipinta dai media internazionali. La situazione potrebbe essere descritta in questi termini: l'Italia ha bisogno dell'Europa tanto quanto l'Europa ha bisogno dell'Italia. Meloni ha dovuto trovare un modo di lavorare con le istituzioni europee e viceversa le istituzioni europee hanno dovuto sforzarsi per lavorare con Meloni.
The same ambiguity has been evident in her immigration policy.
L'accoglienza generosa verso gli ucraini è un caso straordinario di doppio discorso sull'immigrazione e sull'asilo. I rifugiati di certe guerre, Afghanistan, Siria e altri paesi del sud del mondo, dell'Africa, quelli non vanno bene, non ci piacciono, non suscitano moti di solidarietà.
So how can we summarize the first 12 months of Giorgia Meloni's premiership?
Mi sembra un anno di passi indietro sul piano del rispetto dei diritti umani e della solidarietà.
This is what's left of a Ukrainian mail depot in the Kharkiv region. At least 6 people were killed in a Russian missile strike on the facility late on Saturday. Authorities say 7 more are in critical condition. This after the International Commission for Missing Persons announced some 30,000 Ukrainian civilians are still missing as Moscow's assault drives on. The chief of the intergovernmental organization says she's working with Kyiv to help bring missing civilians home.
There are also Ukrainians missing since 2014, so the numbers are huge and they're growing every day. And the numbers are in fact so large that it exceeds the capability of any one state to conduct investigations into such a high number of missing persons.
On Friday, Ukraine said Russia has committed some 2,500 environmental crimes since its full-scale invasion began. According to Kyiv's environment minister, Moscow is responsible for 55 billion euros worth of damages so far in 2023.
A court in Iran has sentenced 2 female journalists to up to 7 years in prison on national security charges over cases linked with the Mahsa Amini protests. Nilufar Hamidi and Ilahi Mohammadi have been behind bars for over a year due to their coverage of Amini's death following her arrest by Iran's so-called morality police in September last year. In May, the United Nations awarded them both its top prize for press freedom for their, quote, commitment to truth and accountability.
In one of the UK's poorest coastal communities, the spotlight once again rests on the Bibby Stockholm barge, a 222-room 3-storey boat chartered by the UK government for 18 months, which docked in July. and is now deemed safe again. The UK Home Office has begun moving migrants back on board after they were removed following the discovery in August of Legionella bacteria. Here, on the Isle of Portland, it's a controversial issue.
It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think it makes sense to most people who really have any kind heart for other human beings, really.
I think most people are afraid of the sort of demographic that it is, which is men, single men, and that's really it.
They should process asylum seekers properly, and if their claim is valid, then they should be integrated into our community. I don't agree with keeping them as prisoners.
As the debate surrounding the backlog of asylum seekers in the UK continues, the Bibi Stockholm, which will eventually be home to a total of 500 men, is seen as part of a potential solution by the government. But the backlog of asylum seekers is big. 175,000 people are waiting to be processed.
A barge in a port on private property behind these barriers, intended to show there was no luxury in the UK's asylum process. But as well as Legionella bacteria, a type of pneumonia being found on board, concerns were also raised about fire safety and about far-right activity in the area. But the UK government says the barge is now safe again and will reduce the cost of keeping asylum seekers in hotels.
I think it's an interesting strategy, but I'm not sure how comfortable the local people are having the barge sat there with that big group of people.
There's lots of people coming over, being assessed as to whether they're economic migrants or refugees. I guess there's a backlog. People need to go somewhere. I'm not sure if this is the right place where they need to go, but they need to go somewhere.
A second judicial review claim has been issued in the UK's High Court to challenge the government's decision. But the UK Home Office says it's confident the barge will house asylum seekers safely and securely.